The CGA Tour, a podcast unlike any other. Now your host, Calvin Alexander.
Welcome back to the latest episode of the CGA Tour Podcast for part 2 of the Big 12 prediction preview and expansion. I would say I'm still your host, but I'm always the host. So my name's Calvin. I got Jake, Patrick, and Will rejoining me, and we're basically talking the Big 12 expansion for part 2 of where we see OU and Texas doing in the SEC and what Big 12 schools could be added to make the Big 12, I don't know, what, stronger, a little bit better, or just kind of in the same level-ish with the SEC and Big 10, even though I think that's a long shot right now. But with all that being said, Jake, I'm going to throw it to you here. Big 12 is definitely in flux. There are several teams that are leaving, in fact, 2, OU and Texas, and 4 teams that are joining here before too long. But besides that, the SEC and the Big 10 now are going to have 16 teams each when it's all kind of said and done after all the changes happen with UCLA and USC going to the Big 10, and with OU and Texas going to the SEC. Big 12 will have 12 teams here in a little bit, but who could you see the Big 12 adding to get to 16, kind of keep on the same level as the SEC and Big 10, at least in expansion numbers-wise?
I think probably very similar to the other two. I was kind of surprised to see the Pac-12 like end negotiations with the Big 12, because I think it's a tough road for them going ahead. They don't really have a leg to stand on other than Oregon, and albeit Oregon's a great program, but some of the other ones are like really, really bad, and they've got some pretty bad lows in all sports. And so I would probably say it would come from the Pac-12 or that area of the country, at least, because the 4 we're adding, correct me if I'm wrong, Cincinnati, UCF,
Houston and BYU.
Houston and BYU. So I wanted to make sure it was BYU. Since BYU is coming, I think very soon Utah might make a strong push to come into the Big 12, which I think would be very good for them, because I also think that they are a very good program. I think they're very similar to how OSU kind of started to move up very rapidly and just kind of become like really good in their conference really quickly. And then they're slowly starting to take on the national stage. So I think Utah could be that first domino that comes out of the Pac-12. And then, if Utah comes, I'm sure Oregon would start making calls. Washington would start making calls. So I would see at least 4 of those teams coming from the Pac-12. I don't know if the Big 12 wants to add any more of maybe some of the Motley conferences, but I think they would probably like to get some of those bigger money schools, especially in any other sport. So that's what I would go with. But, as of recently, the Pac-12 ended negotiations, which just seems like a really, really dumb idea for them to do.
So from several websites that I look through of the Pac-12, what would they do, right? Because this goes both ways. Why wouldn't the Pac-12 also just try to go poach the Big 12 teams too? And why wouldn't they try to get to 16 teams or whatever and make them the lead school or the lead conference besides the Big 12? They're talking about San Diego State as one of those teams. That's fair. San Diego State is a pretty good program overall with football and basketball and that baseball from what I think, but they're not on the same level as the other Pac-12 schools, in my opinion, and they're not the same level as really any Big 12 school that I can think of either. Now, football, I don't know, maybe here and there, but not really for KU even. KU is just different in basketball versus San Diego State could ever be at this point. I'm curious to see who the Big 12 ends up adding, but the schools that are in serious talks as of July 6th, and I think this was kind of the Pac-12 merger-ish, but this is from The Athletic, is Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. of those, it's weird for me not to think that Stanford would be in the mix. Stanford has, and I made the joke earlier, but Stanford has the most amount of championships in college athletics. It's kind of weird they wouldn't be one of the teams with all this strong media base and historic. I mean, over the last 10, 12 years, they've been pretty darn good in football. Not the greatest ever, but that's kind of Oregon for the conference. You can't add in UCLA or USC. They're both going to the Big Ten, which is why we're talking about this. But I don't know, Will or Patrick, could you see the Big 12 expanding where they add in like a Louisville or a team kind of over on the eastern side of the U.S. as well, and not just look to the Pac-12 and the west side?
Yeah, I mean, expansion definitely has to be coastal either way, either west or east. But I think the Pac-12 is much more ripe for the picking than the ACC at this point. I know the ACC's current media rights deals and all run a pretty long time. I'm sure if teams wanted to get out of that and leave the conference, they could. But it sounds like they're pretty locked in there, and the Pac-12 is a lot less on a lot less sure of ground, if that makes sense. And I don't know. I think San Diego State would be an interesting pickup. I know we kind of established that they're not really on the same tier, especially in football, which, I mean, football is driving realignment conversations. Like, basketball is great. I think a lot of schools provide a lot of value in basketball, but football ultimately is what's going to decide these, and football media markets will ultimately really drive the conversation. So I feel like San Diego State would be a decent pickup. I think after a few years of selling themselves as the Big 12's West Coast team, pending whoever else was added, they could rise up a little bit and compete. But ultimately, I don't think every decision being made is to say, oh yeah, let's add, team X who's going to immediately compete for the conference. That's not really what's driving it.
Yeah, I would also say I think a lot of this hinges on Oregon, because Oregon eventually is going to have to make a decision about whether they think it's worth joining the Big 12 or basically propping up the Pac-12. So I do think, like, excuse me, if Pac-12 teams were going to join the Big 12, I would definitely throw Utah and the 2 Arizona schools in there, because I think that's an easier transition for them. But then if you wanted to add 4, obviously the big dog is Oregon. And like you say, all regions are kind of thrown out the window now. Anyway, we already have UCF joining, like that's all the way on the East Coast. I could also see, we mentioned, it brought it to mind with Shane Illingworth, but Nevada is someone who could be in that conversation. You probably wouldn't see like an Air Force. I'm just thinking about like higher tier group of 5 teams, sort of like a Cincinnati or like a BYU. But I think the Arizona schools make a lot of sense. I'm not sure where the Pac-12 gets left after this. And I think Oregon and Washington and like you say, possibly Stanford, they're kind of going to determine their fate here. And I'd be curious to see what Oregon is thinking money-wise, because Oregon doesn't necessarily rely on the TV money the way that some of these other schools do. So I think it's fascinating. I think you're exactly right. I think the ACC is probably not going to send anybody to the Big 12. The ACC, like they're either going to win or lose this battle to join the SEC, whether or not they can get out of their TV rights deal, which I think is in place for another like 12 to 14 years or something. So if the ACC isn't able to get out of that, they're kind of stuck. And then the SEC is basically going to have to poach individual schools if they want them. So I don't necessarily see the Big 12 involved in that. I don't think the Big 12 and the ACC are going to overlap much, but I also don't necessarily see if Oregon goes to the Big 12, suddenly 5 other schools are going to be scrambling to do so also.
Yeah, from what I've heard about the ACC, they have some sort of like clause in their rights agreement where if half of the schools agree to leave all at the same time, then that contract is nullified. So they all have to do it. Yeah, they all have to do it together. But in this, I think I heard this on Titus and Tate, Will, where they were talking about it. But the the primary issue where people are running into the ACC is basketball, because Duke and UNC are two massive basketball markets. And then you've got a Clemson football market, and like a UVA, Virginia Tech, and then they've got to figure out what to do with Maryland, who I know is in the Big Ten, but they got to figure that out.
That's always been a weird fit.
Well, don't forget Miami, Florida State. Like these are teams that actually have some money behind them. So those Clemson, football wise at least, Clemson, Miami, and Florida State, they're going to set the tone for the ACC. Sort of like Oregon. Now that USC is out, Oregon kind of needs to set the tone for the Pac-12. And this is an opportunity. Who is going to lead the Big 12 at this point? Because you had Texas, who frankly controlled the money of the Big 12, and you had Oklahoma, who was winning everything on the field in the Big 12. So now that you have both the money power and the football power leaving, is OSU going to be the dominant force in the Big 12? Is it going to be Baylor? I think Cincinnati could potentially come in and win this thing. Like if Luke Fickell, that's a great program that he's built, and they absolutely deserved to be in the playoff last year. I think Cincinnati, even if Luke Fickell gets a better job somewhere else, if they let him take over a giant program, I feel like Cincinnati is still going to compete for Big 12 championships once they join.
I do too. I think Luke Fickell staying at Cincinnati and not taking a rumored Iowa State job if Matt Campbell had left, granted, or whatever, or Luke Fickell not just leaving Cincinnati for other jobs as well too, shows that he believes Cincinnati can really make an impact in the Big 12 and be a force. In that Ohio market as well, that's a good TV market. The main thing that I think about when it's expansion is, okay, what are these teams adding in? By going and getting a Houston, are you adding more viewers from the Houston market? For sure. You are without a doubt. And you're trying to maybe replace some of those Texas viewers, that are leaving, right? You're trying to replace it with something. BYU, okay, you're trying to get some of the Salt Lake City area. So if you get Utah, you're trying to get that area as well too. UCF, you're trying to get some of the Florida market. You're really trying to expand into other markets to get that viewership. And UCF, we were talking about this the other day, Patrick, UCF versus USF have gone a completely separate direction since they have basically in the past, 10, 12 years or so. I'm not going to put necessarily an exact year on it, but UCF, it's relevant. USF is just not on the same page anymore. I think in 2007 we were talking about it's when they were kind of notable. But we're not talking about USF at all. If we're talking about the Pac-12 at least, what I have found it's interesting at least is the Pac-12 TV performance rankings from the past 5 years, 2016 to 2021. Number 1 is USC, which is not, they're going to the Big Ten. But number 2 is Washington, and number 3 is Oregon, and number 4, believe it or not, and it's kind of hard for me to understand this, is Washington State. And so what I'm looking through, now getting all this off of sportsmediawatch.com, so that's where I'm getting the information. 5 is Stanford, and then 6 is UCLA. Again, we can't get them. And 7 is Utah. So I'll stop there for a little bit. But Utah, completely a totally relevant football team who played in the Rose Bowl last year and has a ton of viewership in that Salt Lake City media market. Oregon, they would be the driving force. Washington, getting more of the Seattle market. Washington State, getting more of the Seattle market too. They'd be incredible pickups to add to Big 12. The team I think that's funny about all this is Colorado. Aren't they just kicking themselves? Why do we ever leave? I know they see themselves way more as a Pac-12 type of school with the guys, the students who go there are a lot from California and a lot West Coast kids who go to Colorado. But, I think they'd be doing okay in the Big 12, probably a lot better than Kansas. Maybe on the same par as K-State or so.
The teams to leave the Big 12 have not fared very well.
Yeah, do we think Texas A&M's thank goodness we left because our team performance has been so much better? I know their money's been better. That's the clear indicator, and that's what's driving all of this. So, but Nebraska.
I think Texas A&M is happy about being in the SEC and leaving the Big 12. I think that's pretty undisputable. I mean, the profile of the program is just so much higher than it ever was in the Big 12, where it was always, well, there's Texas A&M and there's Texas. You know what I mean? Like, it was always Texas A&M was always second thought in the state to Texas, and now moving to the SEC, God, 10 years ago now. That's crazy how time flies like that. It's just raised them up. I mean, now you think of those two almost as equals and all. Obviously, maybe not trophy-wise yet, but in terms of national profile and all, I think those two are pretty on par, and that was the goal in the move to the SEC.
Well, this leads me into asking you the question I want to ask about OU going to the SEC, right? You guys have, for better or for worse, kind of ran the Big 12. I don't want to say that necessarily because it hurts, but you guys have just had a ton of success in the Big 12. I mean, Texas is the most recent national champion from the Big 12. But are you going as an OU fan, right? I'm not saying, you're not going to get paid more money because OU's going to the SEC, right? You may see a lot more games on national TV, but from your actual fandom of truly winning, do you like the move for OU going to the SEC?
Oh, yeah, I do. That's not me saying I think, we're going to go in and immediately become Alabama.
Totally
fair.
What I mean? Yeah.
But I am very excited about it. I find it a lot easier to get excited about. Okay, so obviously the top tier conference games are always going to be fun, like Bedlam, OU, Texas, Baylor recently, even Iowa State recently. Those are always exciting games and all, but I find it a lot easier to get excited about away at Ole Miss versus away at Texas Tech, or vice versa. Just swap out any of those kind of like flash in the pan every once in a while successful teams in the conferences and all. I find that as a fan a lot more exciting. And I know we probably won't win the conference every year, as we have had a pretty good record over the last several years in the Big 12. Not this past year, of course, but before that, that's undeniable. But I think Venables and the staff he's brought in are positioning OU to recruit at the top of the SEC. Maybe not the top, but up there with the Bamas and Georgias and Texas A&Ms, which is still wild to say that A&M is recruiting like that. It clearly worked out for them, that move. They've had a pretty decent streak of top 10, top 15 classes.
But are they recruiting? Are they recruiting, or is it like highest bidder?
Well, the NIL deals, it's what everyone.
That's the reality now.
If you think kids weren't getting paid and induced in recruitment in the past, I think I have some beachfront real estate to sell you in, Iowa.
Notorious clean man Jimbo Fisher. Just he always follows it by the book.
A perfectly truthful man of his word.
He's not wrong with the whole Saban dust up this year. He's not wrong. They didn't do anything illegal. Technically speaking.
And also, Saban's not wrong when he says they bought their class. They're both right. 100%.
It's okay. Both sides are technically not wrong.
He hasn't done anything illegal this year.
That we know of.
Their class is kind of rough right now. I know it's pretty early still in the recruiting cycle, but they're not that great right now.
Anyone who coached at Florida State has done something illegal.
Yeah. And I have the 247 rankings of the last couple years pulled up right now. And Texas A&M has had a top 10 class 19, 20, 21, and 22. They've clearly the moves to the SEC's raised the profile in that aspect and all. And you start accumulating more talent, you're going to start competing.
Sorry, yeah. Where's Texas on those last few years? I'm just curious because
not bad.
Really good. Yeah, I think we've been on par.
Yeah, last year composite number 5. That was a ridiculous O-line recruiting class, which was the area that I think Texas needed to focus
big time.
Year before that, 15, which again, not bad, could be better. 8 in 2020, pretty good, top 10 class. 19, number 3. So Texas recruits pretty well too.
Yeah.
I think just adding that SEC brand, that objectively helps improve recruiting, especially with big name programs like that.
And that's where, like, every year with Tom Herman and even with Charlie Strong, like we were pulling in, like you say, top 15 classes, and these guys weren't going anywhere. Like that's where, and that's why I think
you got to develop the talent then from there. But I mean,
yeah, and that's what we haven't been doing. So, and I think, and as it relates to the SEC move, I also think Texas decided when they fired Herman, we need to become Bama. And they said, so the most obvious way to do that was to hire, Saban's right-hand man at the time in his rotating door of right-hand men. But to get Sarkisian, and we just kind of started doing things like Bama does. Like we started pumping way more money into the football program, putting more effort into game day and whatever. And like the athletic director, Chris Del Conte, like he's just put so much effort into trying to make Texas like a football destination again. And I feel like these SEC talks just came out of that. And apparently it took, months for it to get solidified. But I think they decided we want to be Bama. We want to do this like Bama. We want to recruit this way like Bama. We want to hire Bama's people. Sarkisian brought 5 of Saban's assistants with him who are still on staff. So it's like I think they just decided, hey, why not go all the way? Why not just literally compete with Bama? So I like Texas's chances long term. I mean, I think I think Texas is gonna have some growing pains for sure on the football field. Like I can usually count on Texas, and I've talked about this several times, to drop several stupid Big 12 games a year, lose to like a Kansas State or a Texas Tech or a Kansas recently. Like they're going to drop more than a few, to decent SEC teams like Mississippi State, like Auburn. These are teams that will beat a mediocre Texas team badly. And I think I can mentally prepare for that in our first few years. Now, of course, this year is going to set the tone in a big way for the future. Like we'll see how we do this year. Playing Bama, like second year under Sark, new quarterback. We've talked about this already, but I think Texas will have some growing pains. I'm with you that Oklahoma, they may hit the ground running quicker. They certainly might, and we'll just have to see.
I think for both programs, it all just depends on. Well, so first of all, we're not going to be in the SEC next year in the 2023 season. That's pretty much off the table at this point.
Yeah.
I think 2024 is going to be the year, but of course, Chris Del Conte and Joe Castiglione are, oath bound to saying, when our contract ends with the Big 12, 2025, but I think it'll happen quicker than that once the Big 12 has gotten some new teams in next year, et cetera, and all. So it just all depends on the work done in the next 2 years, be it recruiting, be it facility upgrades and all. And I think both programs are looking pretty good on both those fronts. I think they both understand the challenge that they are undertaking with this move. And I think they're both putting in work and taking the steps needed to get there. So I'm not saying again that OU and Texas are going to go in and immediately play each other for the SEC championship. But I know a lot of people say, Texas is going to have trouble with Vanderbilt and all and stuff like that. And I don't see that being, meaning aside, I don't see that being the truth, the future.
Yeah. Like Texas losing to Kansas it's truly like inexplicable. Like I don't know how that happened, let alone multiple times in 5 years. So that's tough. I'm totally with you. I do think I think it might turn into less of a question of how does Texas adjust to the move to the SEC. I also think the SEC is going to need to adjust to Texas, especially, but also Texas and OU, like being there too. Like Texas is going to take a lot of eyeballs. Like these what would be an example, like an LSU Auburn game, that would normally be like, a 7 o'clock, prime time ESPN game or whatever. Texas is going to take a lot of those big time TV time slots. Like that's just the way it is. So I think a rising tide lifts all boats. You know, a more valuable SEC conference is better for all the teams involved, you know, in some capacity. But I also think like there is only so much time, you know, for all of these teams to be on TV. And I think Texas is going to be on TV a lot. So I think some of the mid-tier SEC schools, even if they're equal to Texas on the field, let's say, because I think Texas as a football team, like I think it's fair to lump them in with the Auburns and, you know, the maybe the Floridas, you know, like
Arkansas. Is that
Arkansas?
You know,
yeah, we'll be seeing them a lot. But
I think I'm really curious to see how they handle scheduling and all once the SEC expands to 16 teams with Texas and OU added.
16 plus, yeah.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the pods that gets floated around a lot. The
Like the
4 team pods. I think like where you have 3 permanent opponents each year and then rotate the rest. I think that's the best plan. I think I saw something about media days recently where it didn't sound like Greg Sankey was talking about how that wasn't like the plan as of now. I think that would be the best. But if that were to be the plan, what do you think your ideal pod of 4 teams would be, including Texas?
Oh, that's simple for me. I think it's OU, it's A&M, and it's Arkansas, because we used to play A&M obviously, and it's a travesty that doesn't happen anymore. Me going to college at Texas, A&M was really not even on the radar as like a rival, like just because we don't see them anymore. Like it was, they've anyway. OU is the rival now, and it'd be awesome to have 2 of them. And now Arkansas and Texas have a lot of history, you know, back in the Southwest Conference and all that, and like some the national championship game back in '61. Or was that 69? I don't remember. Darrell K. Royal. Some Texas purists, if they're listening, are shouting me down for shouting the year at me, but I don't remember which year. Yeah, I think that's your pod right there, because the Texas Arkansas game, their non-conference game this past year, had giant viewership. Like that was a huge game on ESPN.
I think that was like the game of the week in terms of like time slot and all that week.
Yeah. So and Texas, you know, they got run out of town. So I think that's your 4. How would OU feel about that?
I mean, I think that sounds ideal. I mean, they obviously can't separate OU and Texas entering the league together, but because it's a pretty historic rivalry, first of all. But you got to have the new guys stick together too. I would like to play A&M. My dad's an Aggie alum, so I would love to have that game every year, back and forth. And then, I mean, Arkansas would be cool too. I feel like that's always been just kind of an unspoken on sort of silent rivalry, just because due to proximity and all. And I feel like actually playing would really let that evolve into something serious and all. I think I sent Jake a tweet about that earlier, actually, where Jimbo Fisher said something about how he viewed A&M's rivals as so-and-so, which led an OU fan to think, I guess OU might be getting Arkansas in their pod then due to what Greg Sankey was saying about that feeling right or whatever. And I think that'd be awesome. I think that would really boil over and turn into a pretty serious rivalry, because I like Sam Pittman, the head coach. I like what he's doing there. They're recruiting pretty well. He's really turning that program around from what they have been. I mean, looking back to the end of the Bobby Petrino era, a lot of things have changed.
And who was their in-between guy? Was it Morris?
Oh my God. Yeah.
God. They were bad.
He just ended up at USF, actually.
They need some help. I don't know if he's the one to give it to him.
He was at Allen.
He's an offensive analyst.
Left after last season. Yeah. Allen High School, by the way, for those who aren't familiar with Dallas area high school football.
I think growing up in the South, I always knew about Oklahoma and Texas. That was just kind of a given. Texas A&M is a fundamentally irrelevant football program. In my eyes. They always have been. They mean nothing to me. They have done nothing successful. They are Ole Miss. Like that's what they are. You might beat Bama once every 4 to 5 years now. and that's it. And Ole Miss, same thing. They beat Florida that one year when Tebow was there. Like they get their lumps in. And granted, yeah, are they a better football program? Ole Miss definitely is A&M. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, because I never considered them like worth anything. So it's hard for me to, and I only learned about Texas and Texas A&M being a rivalry once I went to OSU and kind of knew about that, because to me Texas A&M was just like there, like they were breathing, but they don't do anything. And in my opinion, they still don't do anything. What, like, congratulations, you got Johnny Manziel. Like, yeah. You want a cookie and you fork over the biggest bags from your donors? It's never clicked for me, them being a program that I'm like, yeah, this is it. Now, obviously, I'm not sitting there in a boardroom looking at endowment or funding or who has the biggest checkbook or any of that. But if I'm just a fan, there is nothing that I'm like, yup, Texas A&M, they're going to push our conference over that hill. They're going to do it.
No.
Because the SEC didn't need them. The SEC never needed them.
Well, the SEC doesn't need OU or Texas either.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, the SEC doesn't need anybody, but I think they're more excited to be getting Texas than they were to be getting A&M. I
would agree with that.
Oh, yeah.
And it would be cliche. It would be cliche for me to just agree with everything you just said, because I don't want to be, I don't want to seem biased. But I agree. I mean, A&M, yeah, they recruit well. Like, they have awesome facilities. They have an awesome stadium. They have an awesome fan base. Like, I'll give them all of that. But I also they talk a big game just for being in the SEC. Like, I think to them that is half the battle, because it's one thing that Texas doesn't have yet. So A&M is very, very proud of the fact that they're just in the SEC.
Texas A&M is the guy at the bar that got the sympathy hot girl number. That's what they are.
Oof.
They're like, hey, I got that girl's number, and they're like, I'm in the SEC, and they're like, yeah, nobody cares, dude.
It's because
is that anecdotal, Jake, or is that
only because he's rich?
Both, yeah. It's because he's rich.
Yeah.
Then it's not anecdotal.
Well, but I want to ask, Will and Patrick, I want to ask you guys this question, because if Oklahoma State joined the SEC, for example, what I would be worried about, or what I would have issues about, is being marginalized, right? All of a sudden going from a Big 12 team that, we just did Big 12 preview where we're talking about Oklahoma State being 9-3 to 11-1, somewhere in that window, to go into the SEC where it's all of a sudden, okay, well, could be tough, right? I mean, there's the Tennessee, there's the Vanderbilts, there's the Kentuckys, which even when I'm naming those schools, all right, Vanderbilt's probably, but, Kentucky and Tennessee aren't bad at all. And so, I know the past 5 years, but still the Kentucky's has been bad. I'd worry about being marginalized. I'd worry about going from a school where, in my mind, if Oklahoma State has a better chance at winning the national championship, that's where I want to be. So do you guys think that this is kind of the best case for not only more national TV-wise stuff and, more money for the programs where you guys can actually, spend that money towards the football program and towards the NILs and all type of stuff, where it really does raise, you guys are saying, right? Raises the sea level, raises all boats, right? So is that more of it? And I'm just kind of too afraid as an Oklahoma State fan who's had recent success, but let's say before 2000, I know Oklahoma State hasn't always been the Big 12, but before 2000, I'm not talking about a ton of success for Oklahoma State. And before Gundy, I'm not talking about a ton of success for Oklahoma State. So does that mean more just being a very worried and pessimistic Oklahoma State fan of, of what if we join a new conference? Or is this something you guys think about too? Of, okay, well, if OU goes to SEC, you can play an SEC championship game, every year, or 7 out of every 10 years, or whatever it's been right now for OU in the Big 12.
I think
so. Let me, Pat. You want to go ahead, Patrick?
Oh, just quickly. I mean, I think I think Oklahoma State, it's just a big fish in a little pond argument. And for Oklahoma State, yes, I think that's better. I think Oklahoma State would be better served to stay where they are. And Will, I want to hear you like contrast OSU with OU in that sense. But what I would say about Texas is like, I think Texas has an equal chance of winning a national championship in the Big 12 and the SEC. Like Texas already has, top 10 recruiting classes every year. They're getting 5-star guys. Like they're recruiting the state of Texas extremely well. And that is talent enough for you to win a national championship. And they also don't need SEC money the way that some other teams do. So like, that's where I think Texas. I don't think Texas needed to make this move. I think they sort of started the dominoes falling on like a money centric college football, which I'm not super happy about. But I also think like Texas's on the field product, between their recruiting and their coaching staff and their funding and everything, I think that they already have all the resources that they need to win. I don't think that the SEC is adding anything to Texas's national championship chances. Would you feel that way about OU, Will?
That kind of leads perfectly into what I was going to say in the first place about you saying that you don't really see a net impact in the national championship chances for Texas entering the SEC versus being in the Big 12. I think what we haven't really mentioned yet is that, so technically these moves are supposed to happen in 2025. What also happens in 2025 is when the college football playoff expansion talks are going to be serious and when the playoff could actually be expanded. Because I know last time the committee met and they agreed that they want to expand, but they don't know how to yet, so they're going to push it down the road and all. But 2025 is when the current rights with ESPN end, and that is when, at the very least, when the playoff would expand. And OU and Texas going into the SEC playing, an SEC schedule against those opponents and all, even going 10-2, 11-1, missing the SEC championship game, that puts them in a lot better position to make an expanded college football playoff. And that's where the money and the exposure really, really is. And like Patrick said, not really a net gain. I think not really a net difference. I think there actually is a net gain with considering the expansion of the playoffs in national championship chances, because with an 8 or 12 team playoff, you have that many more chances to. Was that Andy, Jake?
Of course.
I knew it. But with playoff expansion and with playing in one of the premier.
Might have lost Will a bit there.
Oh, yeah. Well, at any rate, I hope he comes back. But that's a great point. I mean, I think I think that is inevitable. I think it's going to get expanded. I mean, most of the talk we're hearing is 12 teams, which seems like a lot. And yeah, that's a huge, it's a great point. And I think you're right that the scenario for Texas in the Big 12 to make the college football playoff in its current iteration is to win the Big 12 championship and have one loss or less, probably, like that's, and honestly, that goes for OU also. If OU runs the table, wins the Big 12, they're in the playoff, even if they lose along the way, most likely. A one-loss Power 5 champion usually makes the playoff. So the problem is in the SEC, the SEC still, the SEC often gets 2 teams in, like we're used to that. But Texas is not going to go to the SEC and be a top 2 team. It's going to be Bama and Georgia, or it could be Bama and
for
LSU.
The foreseeable future. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So now once Texas and OU have been in the SEC for 5 years, 10 years, like things will even out and we'll know exactly where we're at. But at this point, yeah, that's a great point. And I think too, I think even if it expands to 8 teams, for example, I think you're right that the SEC, the second tier SEC teams will still benefit the most from that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see a better possibility of the Big 12, let's say it's 8 or 12 teams. I see it way more likely that the Big 12 gets 1 to 2 teams and the SEC gets 3 to 4 if there's 8 to 12, college football playoff teams, right? Like then
especially if they don't have any automatic qualifiers, which is what I'm pretty sure the ACC and Pac-12 voted against in the last expansion talks and all, which they kind of shot themselves in the foot with that, in my opinion. But
hardcore there. That was.
But if it's all just based off ranking and all, then I mean, the SEC and the Big Ten, just by virtue of what they are, I'm not saying if that's fair or not, are going to have probably several teams in the playoff each year, which dramatically increases the chances of a national championship for OU, Texas, and all those other SEC teams that are most likely going to be right behind Bama and Georgia.
Because I think if in this scenario, and which is what's going to happen, like right in the future here in 5 years, I think that OU being one of the top 2 teams in the Big 12 year in, year out is realistic. I think that OU being one of the top 3 to 4 schools or 3 to 4 teams in the SEC is realistic too. So either way, it's kind of the same at that point, right? Like on your college football playoff chances.
Yeah.
So that adds to it, which is definitely helpful. And maybe it is just much more of the Oklahoma State like recent success versus historic success. But I'll ask you this one: how do you view like how do you view the Baker Heisman Trophy season and the Kyler Murray Heisman Trophy seasons? Like, are those like, oh my gosh, those are historically amazing seasons for OU? Can't believe I was, able to watch those and remember him and all type of stuff. And like, those are one of the top, let's say like 3 or 4 seasons you can remember. Or are those just, they were great, but wish we had won the whole thing? Because in my mind, as an Oklahoma State fan, those would be seasons where we'd be, making a statue for Barry Sanders, right? I mean, like there's Heisman Trophy winners. So it's an amazing season overall, but maybe I should just say, like, if you made the college football playoffs, is that like, oh my gosh, can't believe it? Because I think that's where I'm as an Oklahoma State fan. Because if we had beat Baylor, that's why in part 1 we were talking about that Baylor Big 12 championship game so much. If we beat Baylor, we probably, maybe not, but we might have been in a college football playoff. So that would have been historic success for us. And maybe that's just the difference here between all 3 schools.
So I feel like I kind of have a unique, I guess, perspective on this because I didn't grow up an OU fan. I became an OU fan when I toured the school, applied, got in, decided I wanted to go there, which was in fall of 2013, which wasn't an amazing OU football season. I mean, it did win the Sugar Bowl against Bama. That was pretty cool. That was like the 3rd or 4th OU game I had watched as like a, like I'm an OU fan now. That was pretty cool. 2014 season, Trevor Knight, all the Heisman hype. That season sucked. We went 8-5 that year.
Trevor Knight, the rare double whammy, Aggie and Sooner. That's a rare combo. That's a tough one. Yeah.
But then we kind of talked about in part 1 how other OU fan friends you have, Calvin, talked about last year's of like the sky is falling 10-2, like it's the end of the world and all. I never really saw it that way. I'm not saying I have more longevity as an OU fan than people who've been on this ride for decades and all, but I started off with a bad year, especially by OU standards and all. That's kind of given me a unique perspective on that. But with like the Baker Heisman year, the Kyler Heisman year, I mean, that was really awesome. I love that. Like just some of the best football I've ever seen. I was really honestly blessed to be a student during both of those. Shout out to my 1 extra semester victory lap, as we talked about earlier, for Kyler's year. But at the end of the day, it just feels kind of, I won't say empty, but just a little unfulfilled because we couldn't get over the hump, especially with that Baker team against Georgia in the Rose Bowl. I mean, that's one of my top 2 worst sports memories, along with the 2011 World Series. But I don't want to talk about that because that just ruins my mood every time. But I felt a little just kind of unfulfilled, like I said, with those 2 seasons. Like, yeah, awesome Heisman. That's awesome. We won the Big 12, made the playoff, but I just want us to get over the hump so bad.
Gotcha. I think that helps out a lot because I want to say, I don't want to generalize every Oklahoma State fan, but for myself, for sure, like my dad went to Oklahoma State, my stepmom went to Oklahoma State. Like, man, I've been born, bred a Cowboy for I don't know how long now, as Jake knows, but any success for us is like amazing. But I think of last season, we won 12 games. Like that's a season for the record books. And I'm curious how Jake thinks about that season because we could have won the Big 12 championship, right? We had 7 chances there at the goal line. and we're so close. But Jake's kind of in your boat thing a little bit too, Will, where he didn't think about Jake. You grew up more or less a Florida fan, right? Where you were thinking about coming to Oklahoma State, for the sports media program, and then kind of becoming an Oklahoma State fan, and now fully an Oklahoma State fan. How do you view like last season for Oklahoma State? Do you think that was do you think that was an incredibly great season, or growing up as a Florida fan with Tebow winning the whole deal, and Florida winning back to back?
I think growing up as a Florida fan, every single season we have is underwhelming. That's just, that's how it is. I mean, I saw Billy Donovan win back-to-back national championships in basketball. I saw them win football one of those years, and then football the next year after the basketball one. So that there was like 4 just slammed in, and that was like, growing up a Florida fan, that was a really good era to be a Florida sports fan, especially as a young kid. Now, it gave me some like unrealistically high traumatic expectations, because now I go into OSU and I'm just like, where are the expectations? Where are the hard hitting, why aren't we more critical about some of the things that we should be doing in year 17? That kind of stuff, where other programs, I mean, hell, even Texas A&M has it and they don't deserve it. I mean, Texas A&M to me is just, I wouldn't consider them too far off from OSU, just in general, especially since Gundy. Like they got money, but what are, my expectations? OSU should be in the Big 12 championship every single year, regardless of Texas or OU being in the Big 12. That's my expectations. And it's disappointing that it has only happened one time.
It's only been around for 6 years, but you're right. I'm with you. I'm not trying to take away from the point. Because, as we've talked about in previous podcasts, over the last 6 years, OSU has been record-wise the second best team in the Big 12, but has only played one time in the Big 12 championship, which they lost. I don't want to get on my Gundy rant, but that dude is just plateaued. I mean, Jim Knowles carried him last year. He was carried to the end of the year. Jim Knowles carried him in the bowl game. Well, I do have a question for you about that, though. Notre Dame scored 33 points, and they're missing their running back.
Now, my combat to that is, well, you know about this. Jack Cohn is terrible, and that is the best game he's ever played in his life. That and sometimes you're just going to have that, and that was that game. Jack Cohn is objectively a bad quarterback, but
he was a draft
based
pick
on the game.
That's the only praise I can give him.
And Sebastian Janikowski was drafted in the first round. But I think the thing is, with what Jim Knowles did last year, is he always gave that leash. In the first half, defensively, he always was kind of like, hey, literally run your game plan on us, and then you're not going to score a point in the second half. Notre Dame just ran their game plan a little bit too well, because Jack Cohn looked like Tom Brady for 2 quarters. But then once we actually felt like we started playing defense, then things were different. But yeah, it's I would say every year is relatively underwhelming as an OSU fan, because I think the national media doesn't put the pressure on us like we should. and OSU fan in general don't put the pressure on us because they're like, oh, think about how bad we used to be. And I'm like, well, most people don't care, and I'm one of those people. I don't care how bad OSU used to be. I care how they are now. But ironically, as we know, OSU can be a very boomer school sometimes. And so they are still like, well, remember how it used to be? And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because at that point, there's a lot of arguments that you could make of, well, it's not as bad as it used to be, right? And it's like, I don't know if that's really the argument we want to be making here. Now, football, much smaller scale. But, it just seems like we should be taking a lot more steps up. We should have a lot higher expectations, but we just don't. So, long story short, I'm pretty underwhelmed every single year when it comes to OSU if we aren't winning the Big 12 championship and winning our New Year's Six bowl game.
So how do you view last season then? As you're underwhelmed? We didn't win, we won one of those two?
It was as close as I got to being expectation without getting there. Literally like 6 inches.
And a horse collar tackle, but we'll leave that where it is. I
was 7 power plays away from being fulfilled.
That's fair. I view last season as a success. 12-2 coming into the season, did not have high expectations. I mean, coming into the season, we're talking about a team that lost our wide receiver and our running back, Chuba Hubbard and Tylan Wallace. So last season, and Sanders, who I didn't have a lot of faith in coming into last season, I was like, all right, we'll see how good we can do. I think my prediction for the season was like 8-5, or I guess 7-5, excuse me. So I was like, all right, we'll see how good we can do. And then we ended up going 12-2, or 10-2 in the regular season. So, I mean, yeah, I guess there's differences in opinion, and you're right. Why aren't we getting better year over year? But I would say, last year we got better than the year before, and the year before that. It's nice to not play Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl and actually win.
I agree. I agree with that, but this is the problem with a lot of the Gundy teams we've seen. What happens usually after we have a really good year? Might have another one, and then we just tank.
We play Central Michigan to open up the season, and then they have an untimed down. Guess who we play this year?
There you go.
To open up the season. It's just, I'm not as complacent. I'm kind of more excited year over year. All right, the team looks like it's getting better. Now it's not as incremental, but it's all right, there's only so much more room you can grow. We're at the 90% mark, and we got to get those last 10%, but it's going to take maybe 10 years to get that 1% each year in my mind, whereas getting the first 90% took 15 years, And maybe that's just the big difference. So, I don't know. Maybe just a difference in opinion.
The way, when I brought up A&M, I guess my thing is our expectations should be where theirs are. Recruiting class out the window. But our expectations for what we expect us to do every year should be where theirs are, because I think A&M does go into every year, even if Kellen Mond is their quarterback, thinking we should go to the playoff.
Whether or not they have any right to feel that way.
Right. And I think, but there's a difference between expectation of this is what I expect versus this is what is going to happen. I'm sure A&M fans would walk up and be like, yeah, we're going to the playoff this year. And I'm like, no, you're not. Now, if that is your expectation as a fan, I think that's completely fair. But there's a pretty big gap between like, this is what I want and this is what we should be doing as a program versus this is where I think we actually are. Because I expect OSU to go to the playoff, but I don't think we're there. Does that make sense? But I think that's also where Texas A&M is too.
I mean, the Texas A&M comparison, I get. To be honest, though, I feel like Texas A&M and Texas have a lot of similarities, at least as far as the offseason stuff goes. We hear a lot about recruiting. Like just almost hit over the head repeatedly with it. And then when it comes to on-field production, like I'm willing to bet that A&M has a better record over the past 3 seasons than Texas quite easily. But maybe it's not. I don't know. Like they're in the SEC. Well, I'm not following Texas A&M that much, where I'm following Texas a bunch.
That's why I say A&M and OSU compared to Texas, because I mean, Patrick, I don't need to keep kicking you while you're down, but our record has been better than yours.
I'm not down.
Since
we're going 11-1.
Since
yeah, they're beating Bama.
Yeah,
you're right.
Jake, you completely missed the first part of the podcast if you're saying that.
1-5-7 year does not a down program make.
They're not going over 500 this year. They're going 6 more wins than they had last year.
Yeah,
let's get this right.
It's going to be night and day.
It's a Michigan State 2020 to 2021 improvement.
Ooh,
yeah, seriously.
Exactly.
Good call.
Exactly.
I am a huge Michigan State fan for the record, so that's how I had that on so quick.
You're ready.
I think that is the natural comparison, because A&M has had a better record over since they joined the SEC, a better record than this. Just like we have since.
I would want to look
Texas
that
A&M
up. I'm not actually sure that that's the case. It might be, but I can't say that. I should have prepared for that, but I think you're right, and I think I hate to say it, but some programs have no, dude. Some programs have ceilings, and like OSU just doesn't have the budget that A&M and Texas do. And it's like they're just not going to get the recruits. Every few years, a school like OSU is going to spike up like they did last year. They're going to go win a New Year's Six bowl, like you said, and like I think that should be a really successful year for OSU. Like that would be a real successful year for Texas, where they are right now. Like you saw how much Texas's fan base acted like we won the national championship when we won the Sugar Bowl. You know, we're back and all that. So it's like I think it's okay. I mean, there's a group of about 15 schools that can win the national championship, I think, and a lot of schools just aren't in that. So I think that's realistic for a lot of schools to say.
How often would you say OSU is in that group?
The group of schools that can win the national championship?
Yeah, that 15.
Hardly ever. Unfortunately.
Why is that?
Because even no one went into this past season of OSU football saying OSU, aside from maybe their fans, but nobody went into that season going, look out for OSU's defense. You know, they're going to be a top 5 defense in the country. You know, like because they just like the players. Like the recruits just hadn't been close to the level.
There it is.
And not even that.
That's
too,
what I was looking for.
No one was thinking Oklahoma State would be top 10 in the country at the end of the season last year. Which we were.
Like
we were
that should
5th
be
in the country.
Giant accomplishment. Just because they didn't win the national championship, like that shouldn't be the expectation. Winning a national championship.
I feel like Tottenham.
Go ahead.
It feels like Tottenham. We're like celebrating like, hey guys.
Who are we talking about? Which team is Tottenham?
OSU.
Oh, don't make me dislike OSU more.
we have trophies though, so it's a little different.
Yeah.
No, but it's like we're celebrating consolations. You know, it's like, hey, Mike Gundy, Alamo Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, but
hell yeah.
Okay, so this is a very recent thing, but this is why my expectations for OSU are not like national championship, college football playoffs, whatever, year in, year out, or even like this next season. Like next season, I think we should sniff the college football playoffs again, but they're not, oh my gosh, college football playoffs are bust because of this main thing here. Earlier this week, Texas Tech put out they're going to like have a NIL deal for, I think, any guy who goes there for like $100,000 or so. That's a starter. I mean, I forget how exactly it works, but it's a big NIL deal for Texas Tech football players. Oklahoma State
25,000.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so not.
No, I just read the article on that earlier today, so that's why I remember that.
No, thanks so much.
Still a pretty significant amount,
right? I mean, that's more than it costs to go to Oklahoma State year over year, right? So, yeah, and I know there aren't any scholarships, so that's just a ton of money to pay. I mean, not to put it necessarily in horrible terms here, but that's like $10,000 less than Oklahoma teachers make in a year. So, like, just for comparison aspect. When all this is like learned on Twitter, then Oklahoma State players start retweeting this like Cowboy Players Fund, where it's like, hey, donate to this fund. There's a donor who will match up to $1 million, right? This isn't oh, well, Texas Tech's able to do this, so now Oklahoma State's going to come out with all this information, and maybe it'll all come out before I even finish editing this podcast to put out, right? But we're not in the same stratosphere as Texas or OU in recruiting dollars. We're not in the same stratosphere as a lot of it. I'm willing to give Gundy a ton of credit for getting a bunch of our players to be that good, to be on the same level as those guys when they actually are on the field, right? Like, okay, you got the Shredden brothers who come into Oklahoma State this year. One's a tight end, one's a wide receiver. I believe one's a 4-star, one's a 3-star, depending on how you look at it. If both those guys end up getting drafted, that's a big success for Oklahoma State. But if both those guys went to Texas Tech, those guys would be making headlines for Texas Tech. And the key difference here is that one school is like, yeah, all players, $25,000 a year for football. Oklahoma State, I don't think it's that. I mean, there's just not, either it's not the same transparency, whatever it may be, but I'm still viewing a lot of Oklahoma State players as, oh man, can't believe that's great that we got a 4-star quarterback in Spencer Sanders. Yeah, recruited. I'm hanging my hat, like, all right, this is awesome. And I'm not going, okay, it should be championship, because you know what? The Quinn Ewers, the Archie Manning, the even Dylan Gabriel's a transfer, but like the Baker Mayfield, and Baker's a weird one, but like the Kyler Murray, maybe I'll say it that way, transfer. But the other OU like quarterback recruits that come in, and the Texas quarterback recruits, and the other recruits that come in, period, like Oklahoma State, when's the last time we had a 5-star quarterback or a 5-star recruit, period? And I just don't. Whereas at least OU has those. At least, I mean, Texas has plenty of those too. So I'm not saying it just, you get 5 stars, that means college football playoffs in 4 years. But I got to look at what our recruiting is at least and go, you know what? Like, this means that we should be able to get this far minimum, but this means that we could get this far maximum. And this far maximum is not national championship or cultural playoff year in, year out, when, like, I don't know what our average recruiting class ranking is, but it's not top 10. And I know that doesn't mean but I know it's not the end all be all, because A&M and Texas both have 25. That. Yeah. It's just, we're not there with the recruits for me to have those expectations, is my point.
I guess my thing is I'd rather go, if I were OSU and you get to, brag about turning these 2 stars into great players, just imagine what it's like if you got 4 stars. That's kind of my thing. And I don't know, but the 4 stars we get kind of suck. And by suck, I mean, they're not 4 stars. Like, Spencer Sanders is, that dude was a 4-star recruit in Gatorade, whatever, Texas, blah, blah, blah. How? I mean, because he was running all over high school kids. And so I guess that's my thing. It's like, okay, if we're sitting here saying, oh, we're really good at developing players, we should be better at developing players that are better. But for some reason, that's just not what we do. And Calvin, you and I always go back to the Dax Hill thing, where it's like we have the dude's brother on the roster, and he's at Booker T in Tulsa, and we don't even try. Meanwhile, Jim Harbaugh flies his helicopter down.
You got me on that one. That's totally. And because you're right, the 3/4 stars that we get right that are notable, that we hear about, whatever, you're right. Those guys don't end up just shining lights out in the NFL. Now, Tylan Wallace, it's TBD. He's a fairly new player in the NFL, but he was, I believe, a 4-star coming to Oklahoma State. Ends up getting drafted in the 3rd round, I want to say, if my memory serves me correctly, maybe 4th, and has not been a guy for the Ravens roster. Maybe he will be now because long story short, they've traded a guy. But so maybe we'll also have more of a chance here. But James Washington was a 2-star and getting drafted. There are those success stories, but you're right. Like the guys that we have that are that borderline 3 or 4-star don't end up being like the best player on our roster every single year. Sometimes they are, but Wallace I think got unlucky with injury history. But no, you bring up a great point, because the guys who do come in Oklahoma State who are those higher recruits who would maybe help us get even higher recruits don't end up being whatever that room for improvement is. It's almost like we're really good at scouting those 2-stars that maybe should have been really recruited as 4-stars, but we're finding them in the middle of nowhere. But no, that's a good point. I just don't have those expectations, because if most of our class was top 20 year in, year out, then I'd go, yeah, you know what? What's Gundy doing? What's the deal? But it's just, unfortunately, we're not there yet. I do think, but I do know for sure when OU and Texas are both not in the conference anymore, no matter what, it should be Big 12 championship or bust every year. And that's where you're at right now, which I get, because I feel like we're right on the doorstep every single year too.
Yeah, that one's pretty easy for me. And I guess the thing with the 2-star making them into good players, that's not just an OSU thing. Other schools also do that. So Baker Mayfield won the Heisman, and he was a walk-on, and I know that's talked about frequently, but it's not like OSU is the only school that does that. So why don't we go for the bigger players? That's kind of my thing. That's just something that I would like to see, but I also think that might be something that Derek Mason brings, coming from the SEC.
Totally. And that's the hope, right? Now we got an Auburn defensive coordinator coming to Oklahoma State, because we're this team that's seen and being better. I know Auburn has a lot of stuff going on, but it's a better opportunity at Oklahoma State than it's staying where he's at. So love to see that. That's an improvement for sure.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, if the Big 12 could add in, kind of go back to that for half a second here, so we end this one out. But Big 12 could add in Arizona State, at least be a lot closer to LA. Patrick and I could, make a drive over for an Oklahoma State Arizona game. I'm sure Patrick would just love to go to that. But with all being said, I hope the Big 12 does expand. I think the Big 12 will expand, and I, personally, of course, hope it's to one of the Arizona schools, or it'd be great if it was to University of California, Irvine, for that matter, right? Make it a 30-minute drive, but. In all reality here, I hope
San Diego State would also be pretty cool. Let's add UCSD into the Big 12.
God. Nope. Draw the line at some point. No. UCI was the line.
Point Loma Nazarene? Are we...
Which one is the Banana Slugs? Is that UC Santa Barbara?
Santa Cruz, I want to say.
There you go. Maybe. Big 12
Santa
pound.
Cruz.
Yeah. Big 12 pound.
We need more live mascots, so yeah, some Banana Slugs would be perfect.
All right, well, with all that being said here, the Big 12's got a lot of stuff going on. Patrick and Will, I got one last question for you guys. How do you think OU and Texas, respectively, I'll ask Will first, will do in the SEC? Do you see first 5 years in the SEC, do you see OU making the college football playoffs? Just kind of yes or no, or if it's a maybe, then that's fine too.
Yes.
Okay.
Because the playoff field is most likely going to expand in those first 5 years, just automatically increasing the odds. But I also think the program is building up to compete in the SEC and be at that caliber in the first place. I'm not saying they're going to win it every year and they're going to make the playoff every year, but if you give us 5 years from day one, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Texas, they would have to be seriously snake bit, to not be a top 4 team at the end of one of these seasons, in the next 5 years, with all the money they're putting in the program, all the recruiting, the coaching, all of this. I think they're doing everything necessary to win, including going to the conference, with the highest profile and the most winners in general. So yeah, I do think they make the playoff. I think, I'll even just say a top 4 team, let's say they're in the Final Four, if it expands, I still think that's the benchmark for being a championship caliber team, cause you could, Texas could because they could absolutely sneak in, as the 11 seed, in a 12 team playoff, but it's not like you're going to look back on that year, even if they win a playoff game or something, as, okay, that looks like a championship team, because if you're 10-2, chances are you lost a game you probably shouldn't have. So, but I think yes, I think they'll be in the championship discussion in those first 5 years.
Awesome. Well, Jake, any other final thoughts to close this one out?
Go Braves.
Go Padres. Go Astros. Will, go Rangers. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and join me here for the latest episode of the CGA Tour Podcast. Please follow at the CGA Tour on Twitter and Instagram for more. And thank you guys so much. We'll catch you again soon.
Later.